Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And each week we have a distinguished guest who is a leading curator or director for the Curatorial Roundtable. And I'm thrilled to have, and apparently again, though we don't remember well the first time round, Julieta Gonzalez. And I'm going to read a short bio for Julieta. And just to explain what will happen today is I will not speak. Julieta will speak for about 50 minutes. Then at the bottom of your screen, you have an icon for Q&A with a question mark. So that's where you can put a comment or a question for Julieta. After her presentation, she'll answer your questions. So I am going to just read this short bio. Julieta Gonzalez is head of exhibitions at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, and curator at large for the Modern and Contemporary Art Museum of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Prior to that, she was artistic director at Innerteam in Brazil, artistic director at Museo Jumex in Mexico City, chief curator at the Museo Rufino Tamayo, also in Mexico City, and adjunct curator at the Bronx Museum in New York. From 2009 to 12, Julieta was associate curator of Latin American art at Tate Modern in London and an independent curator. Previously, she was curator of contemporary art at the Museo Alejandro Otero and Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas. She was co-curator of the second triennial Poligráfica de San Juan, Latino America y El Caribe with Jens Hoffman, along with artistic director Adriano Pedrosa and guest curator Beatriz Santiago. She's curated and co-curated more than 60 exhibitions, too numerous to name here. Julieta has edited several artist books and written essays for international publications and catalogs. She holds an MA in curatorial studies from Goldsmiths in London.
Cultural studies.
Sorry?
Cultural
studies, sorry. Cultural studies from Goldsmiths, and was a Helena Rubinstein Curatorial Fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program, and studied architecture at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas and at the École d'Architecture Paris-Villemain in Paris. So with that poorly pronounced description, I'm going to turn things over to Julieta. Again, Julieta will be with you speaking about her exhibitions for about 50 minutes, and then please enter your questions in the Q&A. Julieta, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, for the invitation, and hello, good evening to you all. And today, as well, I've been working as a curator for over 30 years now. No, for 30 years now. And of course, in all curatorial capacities, I started out as a curatorial assistant, although that was a shift from being a young exhibition designer or junior exhibition designer at the museum in Caracas. And then after working on a show with Dan Graham, I decided to do the switch to curatorial and drop out from architecture school and pursue a curatorial career. And so I went to the Whitney program in '97 and then basically have been working ever since in museums. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, I made a selection of different shows that are not my largest projects, but actually some of my smallest and my most low budget ones in some cases. And a lot of them have in common an interest in architecture. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can do a walkthrough through some of these exhibitions. So I'm starting with a quite early show I did in 2001 called Demonstration Room Ideal House. This show I did in collaboration with Jesus Fuenmayor from Caracas, and we had in common something that we were both trained in architecture. We also both went to the Whitney program, and at some point our interests converged, and we were thinking of doing a show. First of all, that was not expensive because we were in a critical situation in Caracas at the moment, not as critical as it is now, but we thought at that time that it was quite critical in the sense that there was not really a good budget to do exhibitions or anything. I was working in a museum at that time. He was working independently, so I invited him to collaborate with me on this. And also because at that moment, it was the very first year or years of this so-called Bolivarian revolution that was taking place, and that has basically become a dictatorship that has destroyed the country. But at that moment, the discourse was around the idea that this was a revolution. We did not believe in this revolution, but we were interested actually in what those words meant and how around the idea of revolution was always this idea of utopia, but also the idea of built environment, of housing, of different types of architecture. So we wanted to go back to the original Bolshevik movement moment, which was in the 1920s, and go back to a figure who was very important in this Bolshevik moment, which was El Lissitzky. So to go in a roundabout way of how this revolution inspired us to go back to that moment and to think of a way that El Lissitzky devised for showing works of modern art. This is a moment when the Russian constructivists were actually exploring different ways of spatializing the artwork. So Lissitzky first did his Prones, and then in the late 20s, first in 1926 and then in 29 in Dresden, he did these demonstration rooms, which have also been called abstract cabinets. One of them commissioned by Alexander Dorner. So for us, so Lissitzky speaks of this new way of displaying art, moving away from the traditional way of hanging from 19th century museums and making a more dynamic display, a display that the actual spectator could manipulate and also change according to his different preferences. So these were basically movable panels that also corresponded to the ideas or to the types of spatial experimentation that the works in themselves were affecting. So going to this model, we thought, how can we think of a model for our times that sort of performs in the same way that El Lissitzky's model did? And thinking of our context in the third world, in a place which is in the peripheries, how would we think of such a model? And so the result in a way was this exhibition that we did for very little money. And because it was such a long time ago and everything was analog, I have lost most of the images. I don't know where they are now. I had some slides, but in my 20 years of exile and wandering and so many moves, I only have these images, which are from the second presentation at Apex Art in New York. So the conceit of the exhibition was that we invited artists to propose ideas for an ideal house, an ideal dwelling. And these ideas had to do more with the concept, how would I say, not of designing a house, but of thinking of what that idea of an ideal dwelling means. And then the original show in Caracas, the display was sort of like an architecture studio where we had these drafting tables and we worked with students who actually made models and plans for these ideas that the artist presented. So basically, it was a show that was very economic. The artist would just mail us their ideas or send them by email, and some of them were executable on site. Some of them we translated through these floor plans and models. And for the show at Apex, for example, we had this mural, which was this was the project sent by Liam Gillick, who proposed this kind of maze inspired by the Skinner's experiments. So again, it was a show that also was not only about utopia, but also about dystopia. So many of these visions were quite dystopian. So this became a sort of mural that really identified the show, and that proposed this dwelling as a labyrinth. Then here's a view of the Apex Art exhibition. So here you can see the drafting table. So this was more of a synthesized design here. At Apex, actually, we were only given $700 to do the show. So and the show was still up in Caracas. So we did some magic there with Kinko's and also some of the works that we could not ship to Caracas, but that were in New York, we had them in this display. And so they were very different works, like from Anna Best. She collaborated with her mother, who was in the age of retirement, on thinking about a retirement home, which ended up looking actually like a panopticon. So that was interesting that an ideal home actually had the shape of something that is associated with repressive architecture. Then, for example, another artist, Mariana Bunimov, did a sort of mashup of a trailer home and an indigenous dwelling called the Churuata. Karen Schneider from New York, and it's this model we see here, did a refrigerated Philip Johnson's glass house turned into a refrigerator for a can of Coca-Cola, which then became actually a series of works that she did based on famous architectural landmarks. So here's another view. So this is a work by Rita McBride. We had other works in Caracas, but since she was in New York, she lent us this piece, which was about mid-size buildings and their place in the suburbs. This was actually a work by Stan Douglas. It was all the research and the storyboards for his film, whose title I cannot recall at this moment. Works by Jan van Heeswijk, Dutch artist. Paul Ramirez Jonas, who basically did a solar system made with fruits that would slowly disintegrate throughout the duration of the show and rot. So it was more of a sort of experimental show that changed every time we did it. So we were invited to do the show in Chicago at Gallery 400, which is a gallery of at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I think it's affiliated to the School of Architecture. And so here we had more space, we had a little more budget, so the show changed and became something else. So it was an exhibition that kept changing over its different iterations. It became actually a traveling show. It also went to Belgium after that. So it had 4 presentations: New York, Chicago, Belgium, and Caracas, which was the first one. And here, again, some of the artists presented different works or made changes to the existing work. So in a way, it was a very organic exhibition that, made with a very small budget, was able to also push the boundaries as well of what an exhibition should be and what an exhibition should do. And thinking of that model of El Lissitzky, this dynamism and this idea that the exhibition design and display and concept itself could be the demonstration room. So here, this is Annabest Panopticon retirement home with Atelier van Lieshout's home for a terrorist cell group. And so unfortunately, I don't have any more photographs. I have actually this book, which was a book of the show that we did in Belgium. So this was part of a series of shows and they invited us to present our exhibition there. In Belgium, again, it changed, and we could invite some Belgian artists and have actually a more robust presentation as well. So for me, this was an early experience in organizing a very unconventional exhibition with little means in very different venues, and to see how it would change, and working very closely in dialogue with the artist to make these changes happen in each iteration of the show. So now jumping a decade later to 2010, this was a show, the last show I did in Venezuela. I was no longer living there. I left Venezuela in 2003. But I went back to curate this exhibition of an artist whose work with whom I've had a dialogue for the last 30 years, also an architect. And he actually was also in this show. He did this piece. Maurizio Lupini, he lives in Rome, and the show is entitled Spazio senza volume, space without volume. And he was invited to do a retrospective of his, not a retrospective, to do a show. So he invited me to curate it, and thinking of what he wanted to do. And again, we were thinking about the tragedy, you know, that was unfolding in our country, the way that we weren't even living there, how things had disappeared, how this modernity that had become the hallmark of Venezuela and was always present in its architecture, etc., was something that was just beginning to fade away and disappear. And so there were two intertwined stories here. It was the story of a Gio Ponti house. For those of you who are not familiar, Gio Ponti was an amazing Italian architect. He was also the founder and editor of Domus magazine. Gio Ponti not only was an architect, but he was also a designer, and his houses had, and his building, many of his designs had the particularity that he designed every detail, even from like furniture and china, even to the architecture itself. So in a way, it was sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, and every time he designed a dwelling or a building for that matter. So Gio Ponti did 3 houses in Caracas, and also kind of did some interventions on another existing house that he did not design fully. And this was called the Villa Diamantina, and it disappeared. Over the years, it changed hands and owners, and some of the owners, not too happy with the modernist architecture, kept changing things, and until it was basically recognizable, and at one point it was just demolished. So it was a very sad story, but that was reflective of what was happening in the country. And the other story was behind this exhibition was actually the biggest collection of Morandi paintings was once in Caracas. It belonged to a very wealthy couple called the family called the Familia Plaza. And because this, and there's a very tragic story connected to it and to the museums in Venezuela. The Museum of Fine Arts was building this new building to house this collection because it was going to be donated to it. However, the situations of precarity that actually led to what we're living today in Venezuela at the time created a situation where the inauguration of the building was rushed. It was pouring the day it was inaugurated, so water was coming in everywhere, and the Plaza family decided to withdraw their offer of the donation, this promised gift. And the collection was eventually sold when the owners died, and it was sold off and dispersed. So it was also, again, another metaphor of these things that were, so to speak, lost in the fire. So Mauricio's project was about these losses. And so this is the first time that he worked on this idea, that what he wanted to do as the exhibition design for the show. And this was something that we talked about. So it was kind of an idea that we came up with together, was to do the floor plan of that villa that had been demolished as the floor plan of the exhibition. Of course, the exhibition space was much smaller than the villa. So as you can see here in red, these faint outlines are the outlines of the exhibition space. And these are the walls that we fit in within that design. And here's a view of what entered within that exhibition space. And this is the way we distributed the works as well within that. So it was, how would I say, an exhibition about ghostly presences that were there. Ghostly presences, that of the house and that of the collection of Morandis that was forever lost and dispersed. Well, the works are around in the world, but they are no longer in one single collection or in a museum in Venezuela. So this was basically the exhibition design. And some mural that Mauricio did, recalling some of the designs from the ceiling for the original Villa Diamantina, working with some Gioponti lamps and chairs. Originally, this would have been with the Superleggera, but we couldn't find those in Caracas at the time, so we did it with another chair that he designed. And again, it was all about these spectral presences. So we can see this, and this is a photo of a depot he found in Denmark, where they had all these Superleggera chairs just like thrown into a room, discarded as some kind of throwaway thing. So again, the role architecture played was not just about thinking of a display, but how the display also was ingrained into the concept of the show and was part of the idea, and was also became eventually a work by the artist. So that was another way of engaging with architecture that for me was meaningful, but also reflective of the situation that we were undergoing in the country. This was another show that I curated at Museo Tamayo in 2013 with Rita McBride, who has been a longtime collaborator. I mean, I included her in the exhibition I did at the Whitney program, which was also related to architecture and place. And we had an ongoing dialogue since we met in the mid-90s. And so we decided to do an exhibition with her. And again, in fact, she had done a similar strategy in a show she had done in Barcelona, and she wanted to repeat that because it actually had become a work, which was to integrate the floor plan or a fraction of the floor plan of the Villa Savoie into the exhibition as a work, but also as a display device. So in a way, it was exactly the same strategy that Mauricio had used. I think maybe Mauricio had done it first, but I mean, she had no knowledge of Mauricio's work. So it was an interesting parallel. And so, of course, we did this piece in Mexico. And it was a show that also, with Rita's interest in architecture and in Le Corbusier's notion of equipment, which was the way that he described furniture. There was really an interesting shift in the 1920s when he says he no longer talks about furniture, but equipment. And equipment can be anything from built-ins to individual standalone furniture pieces to actually hardware. Such as air conditioning ducts or faucets or any kind of architectural hardware that's in the house. And that was part of his conception as the house is a machine for living in. So Rita's show was very much conceptualized from that perspective of équipement, from the equipment, and taking on Le Corbusier's notion. So this was a view. So here again, we intersected Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie at a 1-to-1 scale with the floor plan of the Tamayo galleries, which actually yielded some very interesting spaces. And here we actually worked because we had money, not like the show in Caracas, which was also done without any money. Well, not that much, but we worked with a local architecture office, which is now international, called Productora. They're now based in Mexico and New York. And Rita worked with them to do this integration of the Villa Savoie within the space. And as you see, here we have a fragment of the villa and we have a work, which is one of the mini parking lots. And this bamboo car, which is an allusion to Camilo Site's essay, Le Corbusier's critique of Camilo Site, and which is called The Way of the Donkey. Rita McBride's plan sculpture, which is actually the plan for Chandigarh, and her textile works, which are elusive of Chandigarh, especially this one. But all of these are done with a color palette that Le Corbusier devised for the textiles at Chandigarh. This is a piece called Arena, who was actually on view quite recently at Dia Foundation in Dia Beacon. I don't know, some of you may have seen it. And Arena is essentially a stage. And here we did performances, dance performances, that we invited people, dancers and artists who danced to react to this situation of the arena. And this interesting column here, which actually gave a sort of anamorphic effect. This is another view. And so again, this idea of equipment elevated to the rank of sculpture. And so these are just these structures for drop ceilings, but placed at a level that you can't really penetrate the room unless you just duck down and then go up and then duck down again until you can traverse the room, but in a way that you can't really freely circulate in the space. And these ducts that go nowhere, but that become a sculptural element also in the galleries. Here we have another view. So here we see the ramp of Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie. Also, this as a stage for the presentation of some of her works. So here we have all these views. So again, here architecture played a role not only in Rita's work, which is an interest, but in how the exhibition was structured and how the exhibition was presented, and how the themes were actually building up to a dialogue with Le Corbusier that was present in Rita's work, but not structured in that specific way. So that was a little bit of the curatorial premise, was very much this based on this notion of equipment by Le Corbusier and what that meant in terms of that conception of a house as a machine for living in, but also what that meant for the expanded field of architecture, of sculpture later in the 1960s, and how Rita's work is inscribed in both these fields, these realms. Then this was a show that I think was not successful at all. I kind of hate it, but I present it because the premise around it was interesting. The works that were produced, not so much. But this was because I think it was The Ghost of Lina Bobardi. it was too present. So we did this at Museo de Arte de São Paulo, where I used to work as a curator, adjunct curator. Now I'm working there again as curator at large. And this was a show made for a year, which was the first year of Adriano's tenure there, where basically the whole project was to rehabilitate Lina's exhibition designs and conceptions for the building, which over the years had been lost. Lina was never officially affiliated to MASPI, but she except as the architect of the building. Her husband was the director, but Lina curated many shows there, especially some of the most important shows as Amal do Povo Brasileiro. And also she envisioned this as a public space, as a space also for leisure, which is something that she later took to a new level, and really which became her Gesamtkunstwerk, which is the Sesc Pompeia in São Paulo. So I guess MASPI was the first testing ground for all of these experiments. And she has this drawing, and this drawing lives in the imagination of many artists who have now become obsessed with Lina. And I think this drawing was also our undoing in a way, because artists were thinking too much of this drawing and not so much on the ideas that we wanted to present or to develop in the show, which are basically thinking also of the museum as playground. But this show also built on one of the first exhibitions that was presented at MASPI, which was called Playground, but it was actually an installation by Nelson Lerner, and that was the first exhibition, along with Amal do Povo Brasileiro, to be presented in the museum in 1969 when it opened in the new building. The museum was founded in 47, but it opened in the new building in 1969. So Aldo van Eyck was definitely a presence, and Aldo van Eyck, who also had a friendship with Lina, and I must say, very lots of affinities in the way that he thought of public space and the city as a house. So these were some of the ideas that we wanted to think about in the show, and some of them were kind of translated, but not in their spirit, but in their form, and that's where I think the show was maybe not the most successful. So these are all playgrounds, adventure playgrounds by Aldo van Eyck, different places. And this was also something that we were very much thinking about, which is Palle Nielsen's an exhibition he did at Moderna Museet in, I think it was 68 as well, where he turned the entire gallery into an adventure playground. And it was a very radical gesture at the time. And this was shown concurrently with Niki de Saint-Phal's this big sculpture of a woman that you could enter through her vagina. So these were basically our background ideas. This is what resulted from it. So it was kind of a little bit sad, after all this radicality. So this was a work by Ernesto Neto, which actually his work has a much more playful dimension, but I think he was thinking more about Aldo van Eyck's structures for these playgrounds in derelict spaces, etc. This was Celine Condorelli's work, which was basically inspired by that drawing by Lina Bo Bardi. So it was the carousel that appears in the drawing. Then we had Ito Barrada, who did this kind of furniture blocks, play blocks. So it was more of an interior And then Rashida Rain's piece, which I think was the most successful. It was downstairs, but it was also in the open space. This is another view of the show. And this was Rashida Rain's upstairs in the public space next to Avenida Paulista, and which was people could configure in different ways. So it was constantly changing. And I think this was the work that really embodied that spirit that we wanted to have with the show. So given this presentation of these shows, which all address architecture from different standpoints. I later even did a show of Lina Bobardi, which I did in 2020. We did it with MASPI and MCA Chicago with Jose Esparza, who's now at Storefront for Art and Architecture, and Adriano Pedrosa and Tomas Toledo at MASPI. And the show also took on different forms. And depending on the venue. So it was a much larger show in Mexico than it was in Brazil, because at MASPI, we were already in Lina's world. So it was her museum, etc. So it was more of a documentary show, whereas at Jumex, it became a much larger undertaking, and Frida Escobedo, who's now designing the Tang Wing, the contemporary wing at the Met Museum. She was the exhibition designer. So I guess that was my last show dealing with architecture proper, but I don't have it in this slideshow. So let me stop share to now go on to other things. Let me just. So this is more of a slideshow of, this was the show that we did in Mexico. So where we had a selection of works from the MASPI collection, and the plinths that she did, the easels, the glass easels that she designed, furniture that she designed for Sesqui Pompeia, different types of furniture that she designed. This is so from chairs that she did in the 1950s to designs of the 1980s, such as those made for the Sesqui. The famous stair that she designed for the Solar de União in Bahia. And this was Frida's exhibition design, which actually she played on this idea of poor architecture that was so dear to Lina as well. So as you can see, some of these images. And now for the next 20 to 15 to 20 minutes, I will talk about some more unconventional exhibitions that I've done, some in collaboration with Pablo León de la Barra. And so this, I'm going to stop sharing now. Just a second. So this is a show that we did for a fair in Rio de Janeiro, I think in 2011. I don't remember exactly now. So it was the first edition of the Art Rio Fair, and I was invited to curate a section there. And my condition was that if they could find or make it possible for me to curate a show in the Carmen Miranda Museum and to invite Pablo to work with me. So the fair organizers actually managed to convince the director of the Carmen Miranda Museum to let us do a show there. And it was actually a show that we wanted to do with the archives and the collections of the Carmen Miranda Museum, which was a little pavilion inside the Flamengo Park in Rio de Janeiro. A little pavilion designed by Raidi, the architect who also designed the Museum of Modern Art in Rio. And this was, so you can see the exterior of the building. It kind of looks like a spaceship with those doors that opened in that way. So at some point, it just became a museum devoted to these objects that were belonged to Carmen Miranda. So we invited artists. So this was as part of our fair presentation, but it took the form of a show that we did there. And we basically mined the collection and the archive, and also included works to dialogue with these vitrines that we created with objects and documents from the collection. So this is an installation by Ernesto Neto with coconuts. So of course, the coconut being a very important element in Carmen Miranda's visual vocabulary. It was a video about coconut water and in the beach in Rio. And there was another video section that we had on different tropical, how would I say, tropical dictators and tropical things. So the show was called Bananas is My Business, the South American way. And in a way, we even poked fun this idea of the tropical exotic that we are more often than not cast into. And we didn't actually want to display any of Carmen's dresses because that was what the museum usually displayed, but the director was adamant that we show at least two. So we chose some of her first costumes of the Baiana for a film she did in the late 30s. And the rest was basically documentation from the archives. And she was actually a fascinating character who had this very, how would I say, ambiguous position, because she was actually Portuguese, but her parents migrated to Brazil when she was a baby. And then she became a Hollywood star. So Brazilians were kind of resentful, of her going to the United States and living in Hollywood and becoming American. So all of that history was what informed our choice of documents for these dioramas that we built with her. So here's Carmen with like a cola bottle, and Carmen in the Tropicana in Cuba. So we had a Cuban artist, Wilfredo Prieto, who did this kind of ready-made with rum and Coca-Cola, Cuba Libre. And then we had these dioramas of anthropophagy. So we had like Carmen Miranda. And some jokes by Pablo Helguera, the Artoons. So it was a way of activating an archive and also doing a show with about $20, which is what we basically spent out of our pockets. And then the artists also who collaborated and brought things over, like Ernesto brought his installation over, Eli Sudbrak, Assume Vivid Astrofocus, the same, and they came and installed. Here's Carmen's collection of shoes that we showed along with his works. Some works by Alberto Baraya, also inspired on Carmen Miranda. Of course, we worked with the artist beforehand, from some 3 to 4 months before, and telling them that we were going to do this show, and then they created work specifically for it as well. So this is Fernando Bryce's South of the Border, which is a history of American interventionism in Latin America. And Carmen as this ambassador of the United States war effort as well. And the condecorations she received for her efforts in the war, entertaining the soldiers, but also as kind of a double agent, so they say. So here, again, we went back, and I must say that the shows that for me have been my most important shows are the shows that I've really done on a shoestring budget. I think these have been the most interesting ones. Challenging because there's no money, but at the same time, having no money gives you an enormous amount of freedom as well. And artists are usually also game to play within this set of constraints. Oh, sorry, it became night. Just turn on the light. So this is David Lamela's El Dictador. So again, a parody of South American dictators. Another parody of also by Alexander Apostol of the Exotic, and Terence Gower. This is Pablo with, this is another work by Karin Schneider, she produced from a Gio house. And again, this is part of that series that she initiated when we did Demonstration Room Ideal House. So these are relationships with artists that have, progressed over the years as well, and have been woven into different shows. This is another Wilfredo Prieto, which is a square watermelon. So again, playing on these ideas of the tropics and the trope of the tropics and the stereotypes. So we had works around in the park. These are by Erika Versuti, but just really done with pencils and aubergines. These are her real works, but she did these for us, very ready-made in the park. These are Rivan and Neuenschwanders that are based on Zé Carioca. So that was a character of the Three Amigos, but also related to Carmen Miranda's films. And artist Carla Saccanini. So these are photos from Pablo's blog, actually. So that's why he appears there with Paolo Herkenhoff. Another show, and I think, yeah, we'll still have some 10 minutes, was, so concurrently at the fair, and I'm going to go very quickly through this, we invited Mauricio Lupini to design to make the exhibition design for us, because we didn't want to do booths, so as they usually do. So what we did was actually, he designed, it was the floor plan of an apartment in a social housing project in Caracas made in the 1950s. Again, we were talking about modernity, so the works were displayed within that structure. It was called 23 de Janeiro because it was a pun on 23 de Enero, which is the name of the complex. And we had all the gallerists sit in this space and share the space. Some were not so happy about the situation, but we turned it into a show. And then in subsequent editions of the fair, we continued to work on this idea again of having a very unconventional exhibition space. So we did one that looked like a favela, another one that was more like a jungle. And well, they were all very raw and gritty, and sometimes the galleries were not so happy, but we couldn't care less. So that was also our way of circumventing that homogenization that the fair also affects some works, turning them in just into commodities. So this was also a way of doing something quite different, and where we as curators and the artists who were also working with us, felt happy to be in something that was not just a regular selection of booths at a fair. So that was the first one. So here are the gallerists. Actually, these two got together at a point and had a romance. And so it's the same artists who were also in the Carmen Miranda exhibition. So we had Dominique Gonzalez Foster, we had Bruno Lagomarsino, Luis Romero, Angela Bonadies, Terence Gower, as you can see, Mauricio Lupini. Bubu Negron from Puerto Rico, Carla Zaccanini, and Felipe Mujica, among other artists. And Judy Vartine with this work called Dysfunctional Family. Daniel Stigman. Joana Unzueta. well, this is Pablo's blog, of course. So this is Karen's design for this kind of caddy based on a Gio house. And the last show was a show I did in a gallery in 2012 in the gallery in São Paulo called Luisa Strina. It's, I think, maybe today one of the most important contemporary art gallery in São Paulo, one of the oldest. I think she celebrated the 50th anniversary of the gallery. Maybe it was like last year or this year. No, last year or the year before. And for 10 years, more or less 12 years, she invited curators to curate a show on the occasion of the Bienal de São Paulo at her gallery, where she would give carte blanche to the curators to do whatever they wanted. The only condition was that they include at least 20% of artists in the show were from her gallery roster. The rest could be from did not have to be represented by the gallery. So I decided to do an exhibition that spoke to the history of São Paulo. And there was this novella by Patricia Galvão that she wrote in the 1930s called Parque Industrial, Industrial Park. And it's a very short, it's a novella, and it's about a group of women workers at a textile factory in the Brás sector of São Paulo, which is an industrial sector where all these factories were. And it's a story, through this story of these workers, with these women workers, it's a portrait of that Brazil that was transforming itself from a land-owning structure of haciendas to an industrial power in the 1930s, and what this entailed as well. So Patricia was also, Pagu was a member of the Communist Party. She was actually jailed for quite a while in the 1940s as well, because she was very active politically. So these are some some images of the show, which I actually devised as a play in 4 acts. So I resorted to Brecht and his strategies of defamiliarization. So I turned the gallery facade into a sort of shop where I had these shoes on display. And actually the gallery is in this neighborhood where they have all these high-end shops and boutiques. So these were works by Sylvie Fleury. So these shoes are made of lead, and these shopping bags is another installation by Sylvie. This is a work by Carlos Garaycoa called Karl Marx Travels Around in Louis Vuitton. This is one of Sylvie's installations. Josephine McSepper's displays that also play on this idea of the commodity and the mirror's role in the commodity fetishism. Thomas Byles' mural, and Edgar de Souza, this table that reminds me of Marx's description of the commodity, where he exemplifies it as a table that when it becomes a commodity takes on a life of its own and dances. So the show was divided in different acts, and so that was the first act. The second act, all the acts were titled, except for the first one, with the names of the chapters in Patricia Galvão's book. So this was the chapter about the how would I say, proletarianization of the workers, of the female workers in the factory. So all of these works spoke to that. So this was a series of works by Alexandre da Cunha, where actually Luisa had embroidered them. So he put her to work on that. Was for another show, but they were from the gallery. This is a series of shirts that Tadek Pogacar did for Daspu, which was a brand of clothing that he created for an association of sexual workers in Brazil. This is Alice Kreischer, factory diagram that she's made belonging to a series of works she's made on factory or labor. And Thomas Byles a textile worker, and Renata Lucas. This was actually a section on how industrial work can produce subjectivity, and how there is something that can come out that is not alienating about industrial work, and how these experiments have unfolded. So this is a video by Beatriz Santiago called Fábrica Inútil. This is a work by Magdalena Hitrik. This is Maytou Perret, Liam Gillick, who I had collaborated with in 12 years before in the demonstration room Ideal House. So this is a work done by workers of a fictitious factory that went bankrupt, and they came back and did all these useless things as sculpture. So it's a fiction that he builds around the factory. So all of these works actually are talking about this idea of labor, or how can also there can be non-alienated labor. This is Jacques Lerner, Muntadas. And then this section, when I actually included Luisa within the exhibition, it was called Where the Surplus Money is Spent. And so basically it was Luisa showcased counting the money. And the last section, which was about the comradely object, which is a notion of the Russian productivists. And this object also as a form of education as well. So these were works that played on that. So I think my time is over. But again, this for me was a way to do an exhibition within a gallery setting and actually expose the workings of the gallery within the exhibition. And one thing that is not in the photographs, there was the office. So I placed Godard's Tout va bien, which is a film he did with Jean-Pierre Gorin as part of the group Dziga Vertov. It's a film about a strike in a factory. So every time one of the workers rose from their desks and computer lay idle, then the screensaver was actually this film about the factory on strike. So there were different elements that were mobilized within the show. I don't have that many photographs, so I took them from Pablo's blog, and he wrote a little thing on the show. And of course, Marx at the center of it all, at the entrance of the gallery. So, well, yes, so that's
Great.
today.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. We'll quickly go to comments, questions. So the first, when you are curating your shows, who is your customer? I don't know if customer is quite the right word, but the art market or the general public?
The general public.
Maybe it is customers she's speaking of.
No. So it's the general public, always. I don't do shows for the art world.
Okay. All right, that's a quick answer. David Ross asks, I know you worked several times on the work of the Chilean expat architect and video artist Juan Downey. Can you speak about how you saw his vision emerge as an exile and how new media in the 1970s played into this?
Okay, so I must say that today I thought about presenting that exhibition, but I think I presented it in the past curatorial roundtable I was in. For me, Juan Downey has been, I think, maybe one of the most important projects of my life. I discovered his work when I lived in Venezuela. Juan lived for a year and a half among the Yanomami in the Amazon, and actually showed some of those works there. And that's where I discovered his work, was actually the works that he did with the Yanomami. Of course, then I began to research and see the whole span and breadth of his work that was hard for me to reconcile, you know, under one artist because it was so heterogeneous and so disparate, until I realized that it was cybernetics that really was the connecting thread of everything. So, but for me, in a way, Juan Downey showed me the way. I had the fortune of being able to work with Marylise Downey, his widow, and Marylise gave me full access to his archives. Without that, I would have never been able to reach that conclusion or to understand that in Juan's work. So I did a first show in Chile, but then I realized that there was something else. And writing an essay for a show that was organized at the Bronx Museum, but that I didn't curate, which was called The Invisible Architect. Juan was also an architect. Writing my essay, which was about Juan's relation to architecture, that's where I realized about this connection, which was cybernetics. And he actually, his ghost led me to the discovery of cybernetics, which now has become a central thing in my research as a curator, and something that I haven't really done many shows on it, but I would like to do a lot of the shows that really deal with cybernetics. So David, for me, is the pioneering figure in this because he did Plato Now with Juan at the Everson Museum in, was it 1972? I don't remember. I actually invited David to write for my show at Tamayo. He wrote an essay on that. And I think he also collaborated closely with Stuart Comer when Stuart staged Plato Now at the Tanks at the Tate. That was about 11 years ago, 12 years ago. So I don't remember the question now, but
So David was asking, can you speak about how you saw his vision emerge as an exile and how new media in the 70s played into this?
well, so for me, the question of exile was not so important in the shows that I did or in the research. The idea of new media was, but in the sense of the fact that Juan was really playing with video from this cybernetic point of view, really playing with the capabilities of feedback and playback that video afforded and what that meant in terms of unfolding space and time. And it was a kind of a topological endeavor. And Juan Downey's work for me is extremely prescient and present in the sense that today, when we see, I think he even anticipated theories like Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's theories of Amerindian perspectivism with his work on the Amazon, which again, I saw it as only anthropological or a work that aimed to subvert the ethnographic gaze, but actually it was through a systems thinking and a cybernetic same thinking that he did it. It's all a set of very complex ideas that sometimes I find hard to explain when not in writing, but how can I explain? What he saw in the Yanomami was a perfectly ecological way of life and an integrated way of life with nature, which is what cybernetics was actually talking about humans interconnected with their environment in a feedback and a homeostatic relationship. So so I'm not sure that I have really dealt with this idea of exile in his work, although he did many works on that. And I think Video Transamerica's is a work that he did out of this nostalgia, of this coming back to the Americas and uniting them with this expedition that went from New York to Patagonia in 1973. He also speaks when he goes to Venezuela, even though he was Chilean, he was going back to find his own wet, dark roots. So again, there's this yearning for the South, for Latin America, and that's the way I can understand this idea of exile in him, because he never went back to Chile to live there, and he died in New York. And I guess, well, the new media is everywhere in Juan's work. So especially as a pioneering figure of video. But I think that David can speak best to this in terms of Plato now, that it was a very revolutionary work because it also connected with these electrodes to the participants' brainwaves. So it was a direct feedback experiment. And to have done that at the Everson Museum was quite radical at the time. And I think he did another work, which was a sort of environment with flowers and bees and television screens playing back the images of the filming of this environment. He did it also at the Everson Museum. So this was at a time when Jim Harithas was the director and David the curator. I think I think those were incredibly radical exhibitions that really, today, when we're thinking of ecology, I think Juan Downey's ideas in these works were very important today.
Well, I can recommend to everyone an
Yeah.
essay that the students here have read, Juan Downey's Communications Utopia that Julieta
Yes.
wrote, which, deals so interestingly with Downey's notions of cybernetics and
Yeah.
systems and as an ontology. So next, Anthony Rosato asks, he's speaking about a friend of his, Riccardo Ferrari, who's a painter who explores similar themes of playing, fun, and games that highlight the architecture of, quote, O Interior do Brasil, as well as the effects of climate change. So the question that Anthony asks is, how does visual art depicting architecture inform or amplify the architectural pieces in your exhibitions?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm that interested in art that depicts architecture, but art that maybe speaks to certain ideas in architecture and brings them out in another way. And if there is a depiction, that depiction is usually allegorical. So I think that's the way I kind of think around that relationship. And with some of the artists, many artists are interested in architecture, but they don't do architecture. And that's the interesting thing as well, that what they do is actually more codified as a critique of architecture, not architecture per se, but of the uses architecture may have, or the uses that architecture has been assigned to by society as well. So there's an interest in the built environment and in the design disciplines on behalf of artists. And this is maybe what I try to bring about or to show in some of the exhibitions that I've done that have dealt with architecture in some way or another, or that have integrated architecture as an integral part of them.
I see that David, by the way, responded. Great response. Thank you. And then in parentheses, I had to feed the bees.
Oh, really?
So, okay, last question. Marcelo Barbosa says, thank you for sharing your experiences. As a Brazilian artist based in New York, I admire how cultural icons like Carmen Miranda continue to inspire new dialogues in the art world. And then goes on to say, in your experience at MASPE and with the exhibition in Rio, how do you see the role of museums in bridging traditional cultural narratives with contemporary artistic expression? Also, how can international artists like myself connect with these dialogues?
Well, so MASPI is a very interesting example, and this is something that basically Lina embedded in the museum's discursive thinking, which was this incorporation of the popular within an institution devoted to the fine arts and to the high arts. This museum was made by a very rich man, Assis de Chateaubriand, but also with the money of very rich people who were very aligned with this notion of progress, development. But then, and Pietro Maria Bardi, Lina's husband, was a fascist and working with these rich people. And then Lina was like the stone in their shoe, you know, this communist lady who was actually into trying to insert the poor art, the art of the poor, into this new museum that was supposed to have one of the most amazing collections of European classical art in Latin America, something to rival only like the National Gallery or the Met in a way. That was the perception of them. And the first exhibition that she does with the inauguration of the building is actually The Hand of the Brazilian People, where she also had this saying that had to be taken out, it was censored, was who does not have a dog hunts with cats, which meant people make do with what they have. And this was the general conceit of the exhibition, what the poor people with no means do, and how invention arises from this adversity. And the show, she got away with it only because she was the architect of the building and because she was Pietro Maria's wife, but it was not the kind of exhibition. It was a very radical gesture at that moment. And this was 4 years into the dictatorship. And she exiles herself later to Bahia, not outside of Brazil, but she goes to Bahia. And because she can't stand that society. So I think Maspi really led the way with this inscription of the popular within the discourse of high art and in the discourse of a museum of fine arts. And I think this was also quite evident in Adriano Pedrosa's recent Venice Biennial, which unfortunately I could not see because I was moving countries. So, but I know of the different works that he showed in the exhibition, and that it was also a reflection of what he's been doing at Maspi, but it is also a reflection of that legacy that Lina Bo Bardi left for Brazil. As for the second question of how, as an international artist, to connect with, I just forgot.
Yeah. How can international artists like myself connect with these dialogues?
Well, I mean, if you are Brazilian, I think the way to connect is connect more with Brazil and think about, you know, what arte popular means, popular folk art. I don't like to say it like that, but arte popular means in Brazil and in the construction of a Brazilian cultural imaginary in the 20th century.
Okay, there is one more question. Can you speak about how your expertise in the attitudes and rules of modernity allow you to grasp the work of contemporary artists? Your work reveals historically grounded research that nonetheless feels current, and in its seriousness proves that we're still working through some of those same concerns. How can the new generation of curators engage with our shared history instead of simply showing what's trending or commercially successful?
Well, I think the answer to that question is actually in the question, because it's all about also engaging with history, but also with thinking of other ways to circumvent certain narratives and to defy them or challenge them. For me, it's been the narrative of modernity. And today I didn't present it, but I did this very huge show for the Getty Pacific Standard Time called Memories of Underdevelopment. And this was an exhibition that had, I guess, 2 or 3 objectives. One was to take Latin American conceptualism outside of the niche to which it had been consigned by exhibitions such as Global Conceptualism, which was a great show. But I must say that many of these, and groups like Conceptualismos del Sur, who had actually perpetuated this idea of art from the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, just being Latin American conceptualism. I think there was much more to that. It was an art made in response to a situation of dependency and underdevelopment. And to think of underdevelopment as even a way of emancipating Latin America from the vicious cycle of development and dependency, which had been imposed on it. So to think of underdevelopment or anti-development as a trope for these artists was very important. And many of these strategies were developed in relation to this, not really as a form of derivative art from the North, conceptualist art from Latin America. So that was one of the objectives. The other one was to examine the conditions of production of these manifestations in different countries, although I didn't organize it by country, but really by the way they address certain issues, from the idea of communications and ideology, the idea of land and extraction, also of education, but also and marginality, the incorporation of the vocabulary of the popular in avant-garde practices. So Lina was actually present in the show, but also Elio Itisica, Ligia Pape, who had work in each of the sections, most of the sections, Glauber Rocha, the filmmaker. So for me, that was an exhibition that it was actually my thesis when I did my MA in cultural studies, not curatorial studies. And it was, for me, this way of dismantling this narrative of modernity, but also shedding a light on the art that was made in Latin America at the time, not as conceptual, but as actually as an early instance of a decolonial aesthetic, because they were speaking about decoloniality at the time and of decolonizing when it was not. It was a post-colonial situation, because in the sense that most of Latin American countries had gained their independence in 1810, and this is the 1960s that we're talking about. But if you watch the La Hora de los Hornos, the film by Octavio Getino, and they actually speak of development as being the new colonialism, and the new dependency. So it was the moment to decolonize from development, from the rhetoric of development. So I thought that was also an interesting idea to explore in this sense and deconstruct that narrative of conceptualism, which was an art historical one. I don't know if that answers your question.
It will have to, because we're going to close with that. Thank you, Julieta, for the people who are still.
Thank you, David Ross, for being here. What an honor.
That's very nice. David is a colleague here at SVA who runs the MFA in art practice. In any case, thank you so much, Julieta. We'll hang up and we'll go to the session with the students.
Okay.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Join us next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.